coffee in a gas station cup, sun coming up in my dash, mud on these worn out boots, pay stuff folded in the cash, dad's old cap on my seat, smells like dust and gas.
Imagine walking away from like a really promising academic career.
Yeah.
And a man you are joyfully engaged to marry, and honestly, your fundamental personal freedom.
It's a huge thing to just abandon.
Right. And doing all of that just because a highly respected intellectual sat down and read you a fairy tale about a bleeding bird?
It sounds so bizarre when you frame it like that, but that is exactly what happened.
It is wild. So hi, everyone. I'm your host, and today on this deep dive, we are exploring the architecture of total control.
And I'm the resident expert for this series, and we're going to be looking at the actual mechanics of institutional silence.
Yeah, exactly. Like, how does a structure that looks perfectly healthy, even gleaming on the outside, how does it systematically dismantle the psychological bones of the people inside of it?
That's the million-dollar question.
It really is. And today we are engaging in a special documentary-style exploration for the series Agora Talks, Voices After Silence. Our mission here is to examine how ideological totalism functions in the real world.
Right, because it's not always, well, it's rarely just some isolated compound in the desert.
Exactly. It's in elegant apartments, it's in university halls, and it's in the absolute highest echelons of power.
Which is why the grounding text for this exploration is so important. It provides this truly unprecedented look at those exact mechanics.
So what are we looking at today?
We're examining a book titled Beyond the Threshold, A Life in Opus Dei. It was originally published in Spanish as Tas el Umbral.
Okay.
And the author, María del Carmen Tapia, she gives what is arguably one of the most detailed, granular insider accounts of this specific religious organization.
Yeah, and I want to be really clear right up front with you listening about what this book is and what it definitely isn't.
Right, it's not a light read.
No, not at all. This
Yeah.
is not just a casual diary or like a simple nostalgic biography. Tapia is presenting a highly critical, deeply structural commentary on the 18 years she spent inside this organization.
18 years is a massive chunk of a person's life.
And her perspective is super unique because she didn't just, join on the periphery, hang out for a bit, and quietly leave a few years later.
Oh no, she was right at the center of it.
She rose to the absolute highest ranks of the women's branch globally. Like, she worked in the central government in Rome. She was taking dictation directly from the founder himself before she experienced this totally dramatic, terrifying fall from grace.
And the title she chose, Beyond the Threshold, it's so geographically and psychologically deliberate.
How do you mean?
Well, she literally invites the reader to step up to a very specific set of heavy, hermetically sealed doors. These are located at Via di Villa Sacchetti 36 in the Perioli district of Rome.
Okay, so a real physical place.
Exactly. From the outside, it's just this vast, elegant building. But the threshold metaphor is vital to her whole argument.
Right.
Tapia is essentially arguing that once you cross that physical line, the actual rules of reality fundamentally change.
And her description of that physical space is just staggering. We are talking about an enormous labyrinthine complex. It's massive.
The text details a headquarters that houses roughly 12 dining rooms.
Wow.
And 14 different oratories or chapels. 14.
Under one roof?
Yes.
Yeah.
The largest oratory alone can hold hundreds of people. It's like a self-contained city block.
And the author actually includes a quote from the founder himself, Josemaría Escrivá, where he's kind of boasting about the sheer scale of this fortress.
Oh, yeah. What was that joke he made?
He reportedly joked that he could take a cardinal in through the front entrance, walk him at a brisk pace through the corridors all day, stop for a 30-minute lunch, and then let him out the back door at dinner time, and that cardinal still wouldn't have seen half of the house.
That is just, it's such a flex of wealth and power, isn't it?
It absolutely is.
And Tapia even claims that beneath all of that opulence, like way down in the basement, Escrivá had his own tomb pre-built while he was still alive.
Yeah, that detail always gets me. She writes about him actually joking with the members that he would one day, come up from sitting in his own grave. It immediately sets a really intense tone.
It really does. You realize very quickly that we are entering an environment characterized by immense physical isolation, vast resources, and this overarching, almost absolute psychological authority that's just completely centered on one man.
Which brings us to, I think, the core reason this narrative is so crucial for the Agora Talks framework. A listener might be thinking right now, well, I have absolutely no connection to this specific religious group.
Right, they might have never even heard of it.
Exactly. But Tapia's account is presented as this masterclass in human vulnerability. It functions as a literal blueprint detailing how highly idealistic, intelligent, capable people can be methodically broken down.
Broken down and then entirely rebuilt to serve the needs of a high-control group.
So I want to challenge a really common assumption right away. There is this persistent cultural narrative, right? That people who end up in high-control environments or, cult-like dynamics, that they are somehow intellectually deficient.
Right, or weak-willed or just foolish.
Yeah, exactly. But Tapia's story, the way she tells it, it shatters that assumption completely. To understand how she, a highly educated professional woman, crossed that threshold, we have to look at the historical backdrop.
Because she wasn't recruited in a vacuum. Nobody ever is.
No, never. So let's talk about that context.
That historical context is arguably the single most important key to understanding the psychology of the recruits she describes. We are looking at post-Civil War Spain.
Right.
Tapia dedicates significant time in the text to painting this vivid, really haunting picture of generational trauma. She belonged to a generation of children who came of age amidst just unimaginable violence and instability.
The imagery she uses in the book is honestly horrifying.
It's very graphic.
She recounts this one specific memory from December 1936 during the brutal siege of Madrid. She was just 11 years old at the time.
Just a kid.
Right. And she describes walking with two older girls, and they were tasked with standing in line for basic food rations, just going to get bread.
Which was a dangerous mission back then.
Totally. They were actively dodging sniper fire. She says they were dropping to the pavement every single time they heard artillery shells whistling overhead.
And then they see the aftermath of the violence.
Yeah, right there in the middle of this mundane errand, they literally stepped over a fresh puddle of blood containing human remains. And she just casually notes that this was the aftermath of a typical dawn execution from that era.
That is just, it's chilling. And according to her account, the trauma was very personal too. She lost over 30 close relatives to political violence during the war.
30. That's an entire extended family wiped out.
Exactly. Her family lost their home too. So this was a childhood completely defined by gnawing hunger, by the constant paralyzing fear that saying the wrong word in public could literally get your parents executed.
And just the absolute devastation of a society tearing itself apart along these rigid ideological lines. We have to report all this neutrally, of course, without taking sides on the politics of Franco Spain. But the human toll she describes is just a fact of her experience.
Yes, exactly. We're just conveying how she frames her own trauma.
So I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of a young person emerging from that nightmare. If your entire childhood is defined by betrayal, violence, and chaos, what does that do to your psychological baseline?
Well, Tapia analyzes this very question in depth. She argues that this specific, pervasive trauma created a cohort of youth who were forced into this sort of premature maturity.
They didn't get to just be kids.
Right. They were completely stripped of typical childhood trivialities. So consequently, when the war finally ended, they emerged deeply, deeply hungry for altruism.
They're searching for some kind of purity, right?
Yes, they were exhausted by politics. They were totally cynical about secular institutions. So they were desperate for a cause that was actually worth sacrificing for. They wanted to build something enduringly good to replace all the horror they had just survived.
And they're intellectually curious, but they were financially ruined. I mean, she describes them literally copying university textbooks entirely by hand just because they couldn't afford to buy new ones.
It shows an incredible amount of dedication.
It really does. They were primed for a grand ideal. And it is precisely at this moment of intense generational vulnerability that Tapia encounters this organization.
But this is where the story gets really interesting, because she wasn't a naive, easy target.
No, that's the friction point for me. The text shows she was initially highly skeptical of them. She wasn't just blindly walking into it.
Her skepticism is actually a major theme in the early chapters. So, by 1947, Tapia is 22 years old. She is happily engaged to be married to a man she deeply loves.
And she has a great job, right?
She does. She holds a really promising position at the Spanish National Research Council, the CSIC. She's working for an intellectual journal called Arbor. She describes herself at this time as happy, independent, and firmly looking forward to a traditional, fulfilling future.
And she had heard the rumors. It's not like Opus Dei was a total secret.
No, people in Madrid were quietly referring to it as white masonry.
White masonry, that's such an evocative term.
It is. There was this pervasive suspicion that it was a secretive, shadowy group that was quietly infiltrating university chairs and capturing political and intellectual power in Spain.
She even heard specific rumors about their recruitment tactics, which I find fascinating because they turn out to be exactly what happens to her.
Right, she heard that their male members would court young women, manipulate them into falling in love, and then suddenly announce they couldn't marry because they had dedicated their lives to the organization.
Basically using the emotional devastation to pivot the women into joining the group instead, like a total bait and switch.
Exactly. And Tapia found all of this incredibly deceitful. She even brought these concerns to her parish priest.
And what did he say?
Well, the priest's reaction is pretty telling. He essentially told her he didn't know enough to make an official comment, but he strongly suggested she steer clear.
But that kind of vague institutional hesitation, I feel like that only fueled her suspicion further.
Oh, absolutely.
Mhm.
It made them seem even more mysterious and potentially dangerous.
So she is armed with all the skepticism. She knows the rumors. She has a fiancé. She has a career. And yet, well, she joins.
She crosses the threshold.
How does that happen? Tapia credits her recruitment to the methodical architecture of the process. She specifically points to her boss at the Research Council, Dr. Raimundo Panicar.
The figure of Dr. Panicar is central to her whole narrative of how intellectual defenses are systematically bypassed. Tapia describes him as this brilliant, multifaceted intellectual.
He wasn't just some regular guy.
Not at all. He was a priest, but he spoke multiple languages fluently. He wrote complex treatises on quantum physics, and he engaged in these deep philosophical discussions about the plurality of world religions.
So he presented this profoundly open-minded, sensitive, and highly sophisticated face to the world.
Exactly. Tapia deeply admired his mind. She respected him immensely.
But then she gets a shock. Her coworkers actually have to pull her aside and explain that this brilliant, open-minded boss is actually a priest of Opus Dei.
Right. And she discovers that almost the entire leadership of the Research Council is connected to the group. It was everywhere.
She was surrounded. And she actually confronts Panicar about the rumor she had heard. Right?
Does. And Panicar's response is just a masterclass in redirection. Tapia writes that he calmly dismissed the rumors as calumnies, basically, the inevitable misunderstandings that plague any genuinely holy endeavor.
Oh, the old, if they're persecuting us, we must be doing God's work defense.
Precisely. And over time, he slowly leverages her profound intellectual respect for him into a position of spiritual authority.
So he transitions from being her academic boss to becoming her personal spiritual director.
Exactly.
I mean, this feels like a highly sophisticated corporate headhunting operation, but blended with targeted psychological manipulation. It doesn't look like joining a fringe cult. It looks like seeking high-level spiritual and intellectual mentorship from a respected academic superior.
That's why it's so effective. It bypasses all the usual red flags.
But I have to play devil's advocate and push back on the author's narrative here just a bit. It's one thing to respect your boss and, take spiritual advice from him. It is an entirely different universe to abandon your fiancé and your freedom.
It's a massive leap.
How does Tapia claim he actually closed the deal? What was the tipping point?
Well, Tapia attributes the final break to an engineered psychological event. It's a mechanism the organization itself refers to as a vocational crisis.
A vocational crisis. So they provoke it on purpose?
She argues that this was absolutely not a spontaneous religious awakening, but a highly structured, emotionally manipulative process. She is invited to a spiritual retreat at a residence called Zerberon.
Okay.
And Dr. Panicar is the one leading it.
Now, the environment of a retreat is already inherently isolating, right? You are away from your family, your fiancé, your normal routine. You are usually in total silence.
Yes. And during this retreat, Tapia claims the psychological pressure is ratcheted up immensely. Panicar uses highly emotional, evocative narratives to instill this profound, crushing sense of guilt.
Can you give an example of what he used?
Yeah, for instance, he uses a parable of a young woman who wants to become a nun despite her boyfriend's desperate objections. He even sings a folk song during the retreat about how she says it doesn't matter what the boyfriend wants because God's call is absolute.
Wow, that is incredibly on the nose, considering she has a fiancé.
It's very targeted. But the anecdote that really stands out is his use of literature. Panicar ends a deeply intense meditation session by reading Oscar Wilde's story, The Nightingale and No Rose.
Oh, I know that story. It is so sad.
It is. For you listening who might not know it, it's a tragic story, where a little bird impales its own breast on a thorn slowly bleeding its life away in the cold night, just so that a student can have a single red rose to give to his superficial love.
It's a story about ultimate fatal self-sacrifice.
Exactly. And according to Tapia, Panikkar uses this romantic, agonizing image of total, literal self-sacrifice to frame the concept of a divine vocation.
So he's saying this is what God is asking of you.
Right. It frames the ultimate generosity, giving your blood your entire life so that Christ can have what he wants. The implication he presses upon her is incredibly heavy.
He's basically telling her that if she chooses her earthly fiancé, if she chooses her comfortable, normal life, she is being profoundly selfish.
Yes, that she would be denying God's direct personal call to her. You are refusing to be the Nightingale.
That's emotional blackmail. Tapia writes that she finished those spiritual exercises completely broken down. She says she was in a sea of tears and anguish. She felt trapped in an impossible dilemma.
Because in her mind, he had successfully framed it as a choice between destroying her fiancé's heart or cowardly rejecting God.
To play devil's advocate for a moment again, religious organizations throughout history have asked for extreme sacrifice. Does Tapia view this as standard religious asceticism or something more insidious?
Tapia explicitly views it as emotional blackmail, disguised as a divine calling. She argues that the intellectual and emotional leverage Panikkar held over her was heavily weaponized to force a commitment she would never have made in a neutral, calm state of mind.
So the environment and the pressure were the key ingredients.
Right. And once that emotional leverage reached its absolute peak, the commitment was extracted. She wrote a formal letter asking for admission.
You crossed the threshold.
She did. But she notes that almost immediately after crossing it, the reality of what she had actually joined began to reveal itself. And it directly contradicted the very premise of her recruitment.
Yeah, let's get into that, because the foundational paradox of this book is the bait and switch regarding the nature of the commitment itself.
It's a huge bait and switch.
The core selling point, the pitch that got all these intellectual, professional women to join, was that this was an entirely secular calling. Like, you aren't a nun, you don't wear a habit, you don't live in a cloister, you are supposedly an ordinary citizen sanctifying everyday work in the middle of the modern world.
That was the promise. But Tapia spends a significant portion of the book absolutely dismantling that claim.
How so?
She argues that while the external presentation to the public is one of absolute ordinariness and full integration into society, the internal reality is one of extreme methodical isolation. It's the systematic eradication of the individual self.
So we really have to look at how that isolation actually functioned in day-to-day life. But before we go deeper into the mechanics of that, the text constantly uses specific terms to define the hierarchy. Tapia becomes what is called a numerary.
Right, a numerary.
What exactly is a numerary in the context of this organization? Like, how does it differ from just being a highly dedicated, member of a parish?
That is a very crucial distinction to make. According to Tapia's account, a numerary is the core, fully committed member of Opus Dei. Unlike regular parishioners who might just go to Mass on Sundays, numeraries commit to celibacy.
Okay, so no marriage.
Right. They also live in centers or residences that are entirely controlled by the organization. They hand over their entire salaries, every cent they earn to the institution.
Their entire salary?
Everything. And they pledge absolute, unquestioning obedience to the directors. They are the structural backbone of the group, completely subsumed into its internal machinery, despite wearing civilian clothes and technically holding secular jobs.
So she is a numerary, living in these student residences run by the organization. And the text describes a daily environment that is terrifyingly controlled. Tapia outlines what is essentially a full-blown internal surveillance state.
Yes, she talks at length about the informants.
This is a striking detail. Explain how that worked.
Well, Tapia writes that there were members of the organization living alongside the regular, non-member university students in these residences. But these members deliberately hid their membership status. They operated completely undercover.
That feels so invasive.
Because they appeared to be just average students, the outside girls would speak completely freely around them. They'd share their opinions, their complaints about the rules, details about their personal lives.
And what did the undercover members do with that info?
Tapia states that these undercover members were strictly required to report everything they heard directly back to the directors.
It is a panopticon. You literally never know who is listening or who is reporting on you.
It creates an atmosphere of constant, low-level paranoia.
But it wasn't just monitoring what people said to each other. Tapia details how the organization relentlessly monitored what members read and thought. The microcensorship she describes is intense.
Tapia notes that as a grown woman, a professional researcher, you couldn't just pick up a book or a magazine and read it.
Which is wild for an academic.
The control extended to materials that seem entirely innocuous. She recounts how fashion magazines like Vogue or Harper's Bazaar would be delivered to the residences. But before anyone in the house was permitted to even look at them, the directors would literally rip pages out.
They would physically tear the pages out.
Yes, because the models looked, in their hyper-puritanical view, bad or immodest.
Yeah.
Bare shoulders, that kind of thing.
She writes that you couldn't attend a public concert, you couldn't go to a lecture, or even visit an art gallery without getting explicit prior permission from the director.
And she says that permission was almost universally denied under the pretext that it was a waste of time.
I just have a hard time wrapping my head around this. If I am an adult, highly educated woman and someone tears pages out of my magazine like I am a toddler, I am walking out the door immediately.
Most people would think that, yeah.
How do they keep intelligent, capable people functioning in an environment that is so intellectually suffocating?
Tapia argues that this compliance is engineered through the absolute enforcement of a concept called unity.
Unity with a capital U.
Exactly. The text references an internal document called Quadernos 3, which outlines this principle. Unity, in this context, is not just about teamwork or, getting along with your roommates. It is elevated to the supreme, unquestionable theological value.
It's the ultimate rule.
The document actually quotes Ignatius of Antioch, stating you must care for unity, better than which nothing exists.
But Tapia points out a massive contradiction here. They don't apply that unity to the global church or humanity at large. They apply it strictly to the organization itself. The organization essentially becomes the absolute truth.
Exactly. Tapia asserts that this concept of unity is systematically weaponized to crush any critical thinking, any disagreement with a director, any questioning of orders, any observation that a rule might be illogical or unfair is immediately categorized as a grave internal sin.
And they have a specific word for that sin, right?
Yes. Murmuration, which translates roughly to gossiping, grumbling, or demonstrating a lack of good spirit.
The psychological weight of that is immense. If you question a rule, you aren't just having a debate. You are actively fracturing the divine unity of God's work. You are sinning.
It shuts down all dissent instantly.
Tapia makes a very dark, very explicit comparison here in the book. She compares the psychological tactics used by the directors to Stalinist interrogation methods.
It is a severe comparison, but she really backs it up with her lived experience. She describes situations where members were constantly forced to confess to internal ideological deviations.
Confess their thoughts.
Yes. They had to sit before directors and admit that their private thoughts were wrong, that their doubts were sinful, and that they had failed to live the unity of the group.
That is deeply invasive.
Tapia argues that making people constantly confess to intellectual errors creates a deep, paralyzing dependency on the leadership. The leadership becomes the sole arbiter of truth. You are trained, methodically, to stop trusting your own mind.
And for the women in the organization, this eradication of the self was compounded by a stark institutionalized sexism. Let's talk about the gender dynamics.
The gender dynamics Tapia describes are deeply troubling. She realizes very early on that the men in the organization operate under an entirely different set of rules.
Two completely different worlds.
The male numeraries have far more freedom of movement. They attend academic seminars, they host influential lunches, and they engage in professional gatherings. They are out in the world.
While the women.
The women, despite the promise of a secular vocation in the middle of the world, are kept largely cloistered.
But the disparity goes much further than just social freedom. Tapia details how highly educated women who had university degrees and budding professional careers, like herself, are coerced into abandoning those professions to work in what the organization calls administrations.
Tapia's time in the administrations is a critical part of the book. The administrations are essentially the domestic support system for the men's residences.
So they are doing the housework.
Right. Tapia describes being sent to Cordoba to work in the administration of a massive men's residence called La Alcazaba. Here she is, a woman who previously worked at the National Research Council, spending her days doing the cooking, the intense cleaning, and the heavy laundry for a house full of men she is barely allowed to even look at.
And Tapia stresses that this isn't framed as an administrative choice or a temporary chore. It is framed as a mandatory spiritual duty.
Yes, women's work equals spiritual sacrifice.
She writes that if a woman doesn't demonstrate visible joy in abandoning her career to scrub floors, she is harshly reprimanded for having bad spirit.
And there's a horrific anecdote she includes to illustrate the incredible physical and mental pressure these women were under. She describes the director of the administration in Cordoba, a woman named Sabina Alandis.
Oh, the boiling oil incident.
Yes, Sabina was rushing in the kitchen, frantically trying to keep up with the exhausting demands of serving the men on schedule, and she dropped a massive pan of boiling oil down her own leg, suffering terrible, agonizing burns.
Just because she was terrified of being late with the meal.
Exactly. Tapia uses that anecdote to symbolize the complete subsumption of the woman's identity and physical well-being into a role of silent, invisible, dangerous servitude.
The institution extracts their labor while demanding total subservience. And while this physical and psychological exhaustion is happening, Tapia outlines how the organization is systematically severing the members' roots to the outside world, specifically targeting their bonds with their families.
This might be one of the most painful aspects of her account to read. Tapia states she was not allowed to visit her family in Madrid for nearly 2 decades.
2 decades. Think about the reality of that if you're listening. She lived in the same country for much of that time.
She notes that her brother actually had to sneak a visit just to see her face. The organization demanded absolute priority over all familial bonds. God's family replaces your biological family.
And the cruelty of this emotional isolation is brought into just sharp focus by her account of her uncle's death.
Tapia writes that she loved her uncle dearly. He passed away, and because her family was somewhat prominent in society, the news of his death was printed in all the local newspapers.
But the directors of her house, who obviously read the papers, since they were censoring them for everyone else, they deliberately chose not to tell her.
They kept it from her.
She writes that she found out entirely by accident. She is walking down the street in Cordoba on a rare errand, and she happens to bump into her cousin.
Right. And the cousin naturally offers his profound condolences for their shared loss.
And Tapia is completely blindsided. She has no idea what he is talking about. I want to pause here and ask you, if the organization claims to be sanctifying ordinary life, how on earth do they justify hiding a family death from a member?
Well, when Tapia furiously confronts her superiors about why they hid her uncle's death, she reports that their response was chillingly pragmatic. They tell her that these sharp emotional pains are the foundation of effective apostolate, meaning the spiritual work and expansion of the group.
So the pain is useful to them.
Exactly. They instructed her to stop complaining and simply offer the pain up to God. Tapia analyzes this as a calculated tactic. The institution utilized her raw, unprocessed grief as a tool to force deeper emotional detachment from her biological family.
While simultaneously demanding deeper, exclusive attachment to the organization as her only true family, it reads like a systematic breaking down of the individual's foundational pillars.
You isolate them from their family, you tightly censor their reading material, you force them into exhausting servitude, and you label any independent thought as a grave sin against unity.
This is the intensely controlled state Tapia is existing in when, in 1952, she receives a massive promotion. She is called to the inner sanctum. She is transferred to Rome.
Tapia frames this as her ascension to the very center of power. She is brought to Villa Sacchetti, that massive complex we talked about, to work directly under the founder, Josemaría Escrivá. She is serving as his secretary for the women's branch on a global scale.
And the moment she arrives, the poverty and rigid asceticism she was taught to embrace in Spain looks radically different.
The stark contrast, Tapia observes, is jarring. She describes leaving behind houses in Spain where the women literally barely had enough money for basic food, where they were freezing and making do with absolutely nothing.
And then she gets to Rome.
She arrives at a sprawling, opulent, immaculately funded complex in Rome. We mentioned the scale earlier, the miles of polished corridors, the elaborate, wealthy chapels. Tapia realizes that Escrivá is living a life thoroughly insulated by extreme wealth, influence, and untouchable power.
The portrait Tapia paints of Escrivá in this section of the book is devastating. It completely dismantles the serene, saintly, paternal image that the organization projects to the public.
She describes a man who's entirely different behind closed doors. Far from being a gentle, holy man, Tapia depicts Escrivá as incredibly vain, prone to sudden, furious rages and micromanaging the lives of his followers to an absurd, suffocating degree.
She emphasizes that he demanded absolute blind obedience, right?
Yes. The text notes that his favorite phrase, "it is convenient for the good of the work," functioned as the strongest command one could receive. It It was designed to instantly end all debate or questioning. If he said that, the conversation was over.
I want to look closely at a specific incident she recounts because I think it exposes the psychology at the top of the pyramid. Tapia writes about the Princess Isabel incident. According to her, Escrivá completely loses his mind over this woman. What exactly does Tapia claim happened?
Tapia writes that she was working in the ironing room with several other high-ranking women directors. Suddenly, Escrivá bursts into the room, absolutely enraged, screaming at the top of his lungs.
Literally screaming.
Yes. She quotes him yelling, "Do not speak to me about that woman. I do not want to hear about her. She is the devil. The devil, do not ever speak to me about her again." Understood.
That is unhinged.
She describes him violently slamming the door, only to rip it open again a second later, just to scream the exact same order one more time before slamming it again.
How does the text explain this outburst? What does this reveal about the emotional volatility allowed at the top of this hierarchy?
Tapia argues it reveals a terrifying capriciousness. Here is a man who holds absolute spiritual and practical authority over the lives, careers, and salvation of thousands of people, and he is throwing a violent, uncontrollable tantrum like a toddler.
And why was he so mad at Princess Isabel?
Tapia later discovers that this unhinged rage was directed at Princess Isabel because the princess was actively involved in ecumenical efforts.
Okay, let's define ecumenism for context for anyone listening. It refers to efforts to build bridges, foster dialogue, and create unity between different Christian denominations. It's about finding common ground.
Exactly. It's about openness. But Tapia explains that Escrivá apparently despised ecumenism. He believed his organization possessed the absolute exclusive truth, and he could not tolerate any perspective outside his own rigid combative dogma. To him, dialogue with other denominations was practically demonic.
What fascinates me is the aftermath of this tantrum. How do the women in that room process what they just saw? If I see my spiritual leader screaming and slamming doors, my faith in his divine mandate is going to crack.
Tapia notes that the immediate psychological impact on the women was profound terror. But more importantly, she describes how the institution instantly moved to protect the leader.
Big cover-up.
Immediately after Escrivá leaves, another superior turns to the terrified women, tells them to immediately get back to work, and explicitly orders Tapia not to write a single word about the violent outburst in the official house diary.
The institutional cover-up of his erratic behavior is instantaneous and unquestioned.
Tapia uses this to show how cognitive dissonance is managed. The members are forced to actively participate in hiding the flaws of the leader, making them complicit in the myth.
And while he is demanding extreme poverty and emotional detachment from his followers, Tapia details how he creates this bizarre, opulent cult of veneration around his own biological family.
She refers to it sarcastically as the Holy Family. Tapia details how Escrivá's mother is referred to by every single member globally as the grandmother. His sister is titled Aunt Carmen. His brother is Uncle Santiago.
That's so weird.
Tapia writes that they are given luxurious apartments in Rome, entirely financed by the organization's funds. They have personal maids, they keep a pet dog, which, by the way, was a luxury utterly forbidden to regular members. They live a lifestyle entirely divorced from the crushing sacrifices demanded of everyone else.
And yet, Tapia notes a dark irony here. Even his own family isn't safe from his absolute control. She tells the story of his sister, Aunt Carmen, when she was dying of cancer.
Right. Tapia writes that as Aunt Carmen was succumbing to cancer, she desperately begged her brother to allow her to return to Spain so she could die peacefully in her homeland.
But Tapia claims Escrivá flatly refused.
According to the text, he insisted she remain in Rome. Tapia writes that he told his dying sister she had to offer up her suffering for the good of the work.
There's that phrase again?
Tapia analyzes this as the ultimate proof of his narcissism. He prioritized the public optics and the centralized narrative of his organization over the desperate final wish of his own dying sister.
It is a chilling portrait of a man consumed by the machinery of his own creation. And it is from this epicenter of centralized control that Tapia is eventually sent out to expand the empire. In 1956, she is given immense responsibility. She is sent to Venezuela to serve as the regional director for the women's branch.
This marks a crucial phase in her narrative. She is no longer just a subject of the ideology. She is now tasked with exporting it. She is responsible for establishing the architecture of recruitment and control in a completely new country.
And Tapia's description of the strategy they employ is fascinating, deeply calculated, and highly deceptive. They don't just fly to Caracas, open a church, and put a sign on the door saying Opus Dei. She details how they rely heavily on front organizations.
Tapia outlines how they establish what they call societies without lucrative aims, essentially civil associations that completely obscure their religious affiliations. She specifically details the opening of a school called Itame, which was marketed as a high-end school of art and home economics.
Okay, let's look at the mechanics of this. Why open an art and home economics school? If your goal is spiritual salvation, why are you teaching table settings and philosophy?
Tapia argues that it is a highly targeted sociological strategy. The school was specifically designed to attract the women of the high bourgeoisie. They were deliberately targeting the daughters of wealthy, influential Venezuelan families.
Ah, follow the money and the influence.
The school offers refined classes in philosophy, interior decoration, high-end cooking, and first aid. On the surface, it looks like an elite finishing school. But Tapia admits that the underlying, entirely unstated purpose was proselytism.
It functioned as a sophisticated fishing net to capture high-status recruits and secure massive financial donors.
It is the Panicar strategy applied on an institutional scale. You don't lead with the heavy theological demands. You lure people in with culture, education, and social refinement. And then once they trust the environment, you slowly introduce the psychological pressure of the vocation.
To play devil's advocate again, a defender of the group might say this is just smart networking. Like, how does Tapia view it?
Tapia views it as fundamental deception. She argues that true consent cannot be given if the actual nature and demands of the organization are hidden behind a veneer of secular education.
However, something vital happens to Tapia while she is rowing this operation in Venezuela. The sheer physical distance from Rome, the separation from the daily, suffocating presence of Escrivá and the central apparatus, it slowly begins to afford her something she hasn't had in years.
Perspective.
Exactly. There is a very specific, quiet moment of realization she describes. She's standing outside, looking at a statue of Simón Bolívar, the great historical liberator of South America.
And the profound irony of her situation crashes over her. She realizes she is living in a liberated country, acting as a powerful director, yet she herself has been entirely stripped of her own internal autonomy.
She begins to critically analyze the structure of her life. Tapia makes a striking, really subversive comparison in the text.
She realizes that a cloistered Carmelite nun, a woman who takes a vow to never, ever leave a physical convent, actually possesses a firmer grasp on reality, more genuine freedom of internal thought, and a healthier relationship with the outside world than a supposedly secular Opus Dei Numerary who claims to be living in the middle of the world.
The illusion of the secular vocation is breaking for her, and this newfound clarity inevitably leads to direct structural conflict with the hierarchy. Because even though Tapia is the regional director for all women in Venezuela, the structure dictates she still has to answer to male priests, known as the conciliarios, who oversee the entire region.
This clash between Tapia and the conciliarios forms the central conflict of her later years in the group. Tapia begins actively advocating for the mental and spiritual health of the women under her care. She describes the most significant point of friction revolving around the sacrament of confession.
What was the issue with confession?
Within the organization, she notes, members are heavily pressured, essentially mandated, to confess exclusively to designated Opus Dei priests.
Let's examine the mechanics of that rule. If everyone in the group is confessing their deepest flaws, doubts, and internal thoughts to a handful of designated priests, that gives those priests enormous centralized power.
It gives them total insight into the psychological state of every single member. It functions as an intelligence-gathering mechanism disguised as a holy sacrament.
Tapia recognizes this danger. She argues to the male leadership that, according to standard Catholic canon law, the women should have the absolute freedom to choose any validly ordained priest for confession without facing institutional guilt or reprimand.
She pushes back against the male authority, desperately trying to carve out a tiny space of spiritual privacy and autonomy for the women she leads.
And according to Tapia, the male priests view this advocacy not as pastoral care, but as dangerous insubordination. They see it as a direct threat to the core principle of unity. But the breaking point for Tapia, the moment that truly shatters her remaining faith in the institution's morality, is the tragedy of a young woman named María Teresa Vegas.
Tapia presents the story of María Teresa Vegas as perhaps the darkest, most damning incident recounted in the book. María Teresa was one of the early Venezuelan recruits. She was dedicated, and she was eventually sent from Venezuela to Rome to study and work at the central headquarters.
And then one day, Tapia receives a terse, cryptic telegram from Rome. It simply states that Maria Teresa is arriving on a transatlantic flight and that she is suddenly no longer a member of the organization.
Tapia rushes to the airport in Caracas to meet the flight, and what she claims she finds is horrifying. Maria Teresa is completely incapacitated. Tapia writes that the young woman was heavily drugged, semi-conscious, and severely medicated.
Tapia accuses the central government in Rome of taking a young woman who is clearly experiencing a severe mental health crisis, putting her onto a transatlantic flight entirely alone, heavily sedated, without a medical escort, and without giving her family or Tapia any detailed warning or explanation.
Tapia uses this incident to ask a crucial, devastating question. Is this the paternal love the founder constantly preaches about? To discard a broken human being like a piece of defective industrial machinery?
It's treating a person as disposable.
Tapia writes that this event exposed the absolute void of empathy at the core of the institution. She realizes the organization operates as a cold corporate mechanism that prioritizes its own sanitized image and operational efficiency over the basic humanity, sanity, and safety of its members.
If someone's mind breaks under the pressure, the institution's response isn't care. It's immediate expulsion and erasure. And it is shortly after this realization, after Tapia has spent months advocating for her women and questioning the harsh directives coming from Rome, that the trap is finally sprung on her.
In late 1965, Tapia receives sudden orders recalling her to Rome. She is told it is just for a standard administrative meeting. But she notes that the moment she steps off the plane in Rome, the atmosphere is chillingly different. The members who pick her up are silent and cold.
And Tapia details that the very first thing they do when she crosses the threshold back into the Villa Sacchetti headquarters is confiscate her passport.
From that moment, Tapia states she is effectively a prisoner. She is immediately isolated from the rest of the house. She is forbidden to speak to the other women she has known for years. She is barred from making outside phone calls. Her incoming and outgoing mail is intercepted and read.
She is trapped within the very building she once helped run. In our outline for this episode, there is a compelling analogy comparing her situation to Alexander Solzhenitsyn's novel The First Circle. Can you expand on why that parallel is so accurate based on Tapia's account?
It is a very apt analogy for the psychological environment she describes. The First Circle depicts the Sharashka, a special prison designed for scientists and intellectuals within the Soviet Gulag system.
Right.
The inmates there are technically housed in better conditions than regular Gulag prisoners. They have warmth and food, but they are absolutely unfree. They were trapped in a paranoid, surveillance-heavy environment where their intellect is systematically exploited by the state. Tapia argues she is in her own religious Sharashka.
She is surrounded by the elegant trappings of a global headquarters, but she is subjected to sheer, paralyzing terror.
She describes a brutal psychological siege. She is subjected to what she explicitly calls checas, a term referencing the brutal interrogation centers used during the Spanish Civil War.
She describes being pulled into rooms by high-ranking directors, specifically naming Mercedes Morado and Marley's Kicking, who subject her to relentless, repetitive interrogations lasting for hours.
Tapia writes that they continually demand she confess to murmuration, to speaking ill of the founder and fracturing the unity of the organization. They want her to incriminate herself, to formally admit that her attempts to secure basic freedoms for the women in Venezuela were not acts of care, but acts of malicious rebellion.
She quotes them yelling at her, "Do you have such a lax conscience? Think, who did you talk to?" Tapia frames this as classic brainwashing methodology. The goal is to break the subject down through exhaustion and repetition until they begin to doubt their own memory, their own motives, and their own reality.
And this psychological torture culminates in a devastating final confrontation with Escrivá himself.
Tapia writes that he summons her. And he doesn't just accuse her of administrative disagreement or insubordination. He escalates it to an entirely different level. She claims he accuses her of horrendous, completely unnamed sexual depravities. He yells that she has corrupted the women in Venezuela.
Tapia analyzes this as the ultimate use of character assassination, as institutional leverage. According to her account, he presents her with a brutal ultimatum. She must formally ask for a dispensation official permission to leave the organization immediately.
And if she doesn't?
If she refuses to leave voluntarily, he threatens to subject her to an internal ecclesiastical tribunal that will send a damning report to the Vatican, permanently and completely dishonoring her name within the Catholic Church.
Tapia's narrative here is stark. She's accusing him of threatening to ruin her life, her reputation, and her standing in her faith community using entirely fabricated accusations of sexual deviance. She views it as pure, unadulterated blackmail.
Tapia writes that she realized in that moment she had absolutely no choice. She knew the institution had the power, the resources, and the connections to destroy her.
Furthermore, she expresses a genuine, terrifying fear that if she resisted, they might physically drug her and have her committed to a psychiatric asylum, a tactic she claims she knew had been used against other members who became problematic.
The sequence she describes detailing her escape reads like a Cold War thriller. She is trapped in this compound. She needs to get rid of any personal items or evidence they could twist and use against her. So she writes about throwing the keys to her private post office box out a high window, praying they land in a neighbor's garden so the directors can't find them.
And she takes one final, massive risk. She spots a telephone that has been momentarily left unguarded by the directors. She manages to make a desperate, forbidden call to a journalist friend, a man named Ismail Medina, who she knew happened to be in Rome at the time.
She tells him she is in a life-threatening emergency and begs him to come to the building and get her out.
Tapia credits that outside intervention with saving her. Because Medina arrives and demands to see her, she manages to secure her physical exit. She signs the dispensation papers under severe duress.
She crosses back over that heavy threshold to the outside world, but she notes that she walks out entirely broken, stripped of her career, her savings, and her identity after 18 years of systematic erasure.
But the truly terrifying part of Tapia's account is that the story doesn't end when she walks out the door. She argues that in a high-control group, leaving is not the end of the punishment. This brings us to the final, most insidious mechanic of institutional silence, the weaponization of silence and the concept of damnatio memoriae.
Damnatio memoriae, the Roman practice of the condemnation of memory, literally erasing someone's existence from the historical record.
Tapia explains that once a person leaves the organization, they immediately become a non-person. The institution enforces a strict, absolute policy of silence regarding departed members.
The members who remain inside are strictly forbidden to ask about where their friends went. If questions are pushed, Tapia states, the standard institutional lie is that the departed person was sick, exhausted, or went insane.
That is a brilliant, vicious tactic. They pathologize the departure to protect the institution's flawless image. If someone leaves, the narrative dictates it cannot possibly be because the organization is flawed or abusive. It must be because the individual's mind broke under the purity of the calling.
But Tapia reveals that the campaign of erasure goes far beyond just internal silence. When Tapia eventually tries to rebuild her shattered life, she eventually moves to the United States and works at a university. But before that, she secures a job at a highly prestigious law firm in Spain, the Garrigues firm.
And Tapia claims the organization actively tracks her down.
She provides evidence that they wrote letters directly to her new employers, official correspondence from the organization, claiming she had led a stray life of horrendous depravity. Tapia argues they were actively attempting to ruin her secular career, to poison her reputation and essentially starve her out.
It is presented as a terrifying demonstration of institutional reach and vindictiveness. The message is clear. If you leave us, you will not survive without us. We will make sure of it.
But the ultimate, most consequential display of this power involves the highest levels of the Catholic Church itself. Tapia details this in the epilogue of her experience. It concerns the Beatification Tribunal for Josemaría Escrivá.
When the organization officially puts him forward for sainthood, Tapia argues they marshal all their resources to control the narrative entirely.
Critical voices. People who knew him intimately, who worked alongside him for decades and witnessed his abusive behavior, like Tapia, are deliberately and methodically excluded from testifying before the Vatican.
Tapia knows that the organization argued to the Vatican that witnesses like her were not suitable because they harbored resentment. But she claims it goes much further than just exclusion. She accuses them of actively lying to the tribunal to discredit her.
Tapia discovers in the tribunal documents that the institution formally claims she was part of an organized, malicious, defamatory campaign against Escrivá. Specifically, they falsely stated to the Vatican judges that she had helped prepare a highly critical television program about Opus Dei on a Spanish show called Le Clove,
which Tapia states emphatically in her book she absolutely did not do. She writes that she explicitly refused to participate in that program.
But she points out that the lie served its institutional purpose perfectly. It thoroughly discredited her in the eyes of the Vatican judges, ensuring that the tribunal only heard the positive, carefully sanitized, deeply loyal testimonies provided by Escrivá's hand-picked successors.
So based on Tapia's exhaustive account, I have to ask you, the listener, to consider the broader implications here. If a closed institution can successfully manipulate the historical record at the highest levels of the Vatican, using allegedly fabricated claims to ensure the sainthood of its founder, what does that tell us about the extreme fragility of truth when it is trapped inside a closed system?
It suggests, as Tapia's narrative insists, that in these environments, objective truth is entirely subordinate to power, to optics, and to institutional survival. When a structure is hermetically sealed, accountability vanishes, and the narrative is written entirely by the victors who hold the keys.
Okay, let's synthesize the journey we've taken through Tapia's text. Beyond the Threshold is a vital inclusion in the Agora Talks series because it maps the exact granular coordinates of a specific human tragedy. It claims to show exactly how pure spiritual idealism, the desperate desire of a war-torn generation to do good, can be methodically converted into fanatical, blind obedience.
And it demonstrates how silence serves a dual purpose in totalist structures. Silence is used as an impenetrable shield to protect the powerful from outside scrutiny, and simultaneously, it is weaponized against the vulnerable to enforce compliance, isolate them, and completely erase their dissent.
The human toll Tapia outlines is staggering. She asks us to look at the wasted intellects of brilliant women forced to abandon science, to scrub floors in silence. She asks us to consider the individuals pushed to the brink of madness, completely hidden behind a polished, social acceptable veneer of secular sanctity.
Tapia's story, ultimately, is positioned as a severe warning about the hidden mechanics of control. It forces the reader to aggressively examine the structures and institutions they inherently trust.
Exactly, because we so often think of censorship, brainwashing, and relentless surveillance as the exclusive tools of hostile, authoritarian governments or isolated doomsday cults living in compounds off the grid. But Tapia's account claims this happened in elegant apartments in Rome and Madrid. It happened among university professors, wealthy families, and respected professionals.
It happened as the organization itself claims to operate, right in the middle of the world.
So we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Building on what Tapia survived, we think of these high-control groups as physical spaces, heavy doors in Rome you can't walk out of. But Tapia's account is fundamentally about how the desire for unity is weaponized to enforce silence and compliance. Look at the digital spaces we inhabit today.
That's a great point.
How often do the social media algorithms we interact with every day enforce a modern, digitized version of unity by punishing dissenting opinions or hiding them from the feed? Are we participating in our own 21st century version of murmuration when we pile on to someone who steps even an inch outside the accepted narrative of our particular online tribe?
It's a sobering question.
If the doors to our digital echo chambers are hermetically sealed by code rather than wood and iron, who is really holding the key?
My blessings on the center line, count my losses in the passing pines. If every wrong turn still somehow led me here to you, guess I can't complain when I look back through this back road real view. First scar on my knuckle from a fight